Debates on the real presence versus memorialist ideas of the Eucharist are often framed as a literal versus a non-literal or symbolic reading of the relevant biblical passages. It plays on the sentiment, the very common sense sentiment, that the literal meaning of a passage should be preferred by default. And normally this is true, obviously with exceptions, but nonetheless normally true. And so memorialists such as myself would attempt to argue that a non-literal reading of the passages makes better sense. This would include me doing things like reframing the real presence as an ontological reading for clarity's sake, rather than simply a literal reading, which would then act as a segue for me to argue that is often does not denote ontology in regular human speech, whatever era or language we're talking about. But I was also thinking recently that when you really get into it, the real presence is not actually a literal interpretation either. And I believe this becomes obvious when we consider just what we mean by literal. Discerning a good and workable definition of literal, I believe, will go a long way to demonstrating why the real presence really doesn't fit in a reasonable conception of literal. And I believe we can find such a succinct and wide and well-accounting definition from the Oxford Languages English Dictionary, which reads, quote, "Taking words in their usual or most basic sense without metaphor or exaggeration." This, I believe, is a very sensible definition and very easily encapsulates the use of literal in Eucharist debates, but also more generally across the board in human discussion. And an easy example I can give to demonstrate this definition can be as follows. Let's say I'm told by a friend that another mutual friend spilled water on a very expensive book that I loaned him. And in reply, I say in frustration, "Gah, I'm gonna kill that guy." The literal sense of this would be that I'm announcing my intention to commit homicide, which I obviously would not do in that situation. Rather, the context of modern Western culture, the present situation, and the idiomatic use of the English language would tell the English-speaking listener that I'm mad at my friend and will let that out on him in some way, and it's unlikely that this would be murder. With this basic understanding of what it means for something to be literal, the problem becomes very, very apparent. The real presence does not take the words of Christ at the Last Supper or in John chapter 6, granting for the moment that it is talking about the Eucharist, in their usual or most basic sense. Doing so would mean that Christ is offering actual physical flesh to eat and real liquid blood to drink in John chapter 6, and that the bread and wine is either transformed into flesh and blood at the Last Supper, or Christ himself was a bread man powered by wine in his circulatory system, thus really having bread for flesh and wine for blood. Rather, real presence theories rely on highly developed, abstract senses of ontology. When saying, "this bread is my body," he, Christ, is not saying that the bread is actually a piece of his body, and likewise in saying, "you must eat my flesh," he is not actually telling them to eat physical flesh. Rather, he allegedly means eating a piece of bread which possesses an imperceptible abstract substance identified with the being of Christ's body. So, not only is the real presence not a literal reading, but it's only barely an ontological one at that, since an ontological sense of to be verbs like is, am, are, so on, virtually always entail in human discourse a full package of being, substance, and accidents. That is, real physical properties corresponding to the label that we are stating. So, for example, when I pick up this object and say, "this is a water bottle," it would always be understood, assuming I am speaking literally, that I really mean the object itself possesses a set of features that, when present together, are labeled a water bottle. It would never be assumed that I'm talking about an imperceptible substance underlying a clump of matter that otherwise has no relation to it. For apologetics of Lutheran, Anglican, and Eastern real presence Eucharistologies, that's the extent of the problem. And it's a pretty big one, but that's about as far as it goes, in my opinion. But for Romanist Eucharist apologetics, there is an even worse problem. The bread doesn't simply have the substance of the body, nor the wine simply that of the blood in Romanist Eucharistology, but both elements, rather, contain the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Christ. So even the little remaining of a literal reading of the passages in Holy Scripture is eviscerated in the Roman system by declaring that the couplets of bread and body and wine and blood are redundant, if not outright misleading when reading them in themselves. In sum, a real presence interpretation is not literal, so non-literal that the sense in which it interprets to be is virtually exclusive to Eucharistic discussions, whilst a representational interpretation of to be is very common in human discourse everywhere. I'll make something clear as I wrap up. This is not an argument in itself against the real presence. It's just simply a very common and, in my opinion, foundational apologetic tactic used in order to demonstrate the real presence itself. It's perfectly possible that my argument is 100% correct, the real presence is not, properly speaking, literal, and yet it's still a true doctrine nonetheless. It's simply my observation of how it is defended in popular online apologetics and even more developed apologetics by greater thinkers. And I'm just hoping to dispatch of the confusions behind it, because I believe it does really rely on a pretty egregious bait and switch with regards to how we understand words. And so I'm hoping that this video overall leads to greater understanding and more honest and clear discussion on this issue as we go forward. So thank you very much for watching, and I really do hope that you got some benefit out of it, learned something new, even if you ultimately disagree with me and are still holding to a real presence Eucharistology. Nonetheless, I hope anyone who watched this learned a thing or two, and it really does advance the discussion in the future, as I just said. Please do remember to like, subscribe, follow all my social media down below, even consider supporting me. And speaking of support, thank you very much to all my loyal supporters, all listed here. Without you guys, I would simply not be doing this right now. I'd be too busy scrambling for work. And your support really does make this possible. Your support helps me turn this into a job. And God willing, the more support I get, the closer it can become to a reality of being even a partially livable side income. So thank you all very much for your support. Thank you for everyone subscribing. Thank you for those who watch. I hope you all have a lovely and blessed day. Have a good one.